James Cooper had spent the better part of 8 years in the rhythm of invisibility. Most people in Eagles Rest knew him as Big Jim, the man who sold heirloom tomatoes and black garlic at the Saturday market, who always wore the same battered flannel, and whose laugh came slow but easy. He was overweight, bearded, slow to anger, quicker to help. Nobody asked too many questions. Why would they? He wasn't a threat. He wasn't interesting. And that's exactly what he'd spent 8 years crafting. Behind the greenhouse, past the old hay barn and underneath what looked like a rusted equipment shed, was something else entirely. Sealed beneath reinforced concrete, James Cooper had built a command center more advanced than the regional DHS office. Hidden thermal and acoustic insulation masked any heat signatures. Power lines ran underground and routed through a maze of dummy transformers to avoid detection. A full satellite uplink connected to a redundant array of servers designed to operate even under electromagnetic attack. He didn't just live in Eagles Rest. He was watching it. Every road. Every pattern. Every anomaly. And until that morning at the market, no one had ever known. It started small. The Storm Riders weren't new. They'd been around the tri-state area for over a decade. Just another leather and tattoo outfit running meth and flexing in roadhouses. But something had changed. The bikes were newer now, cleaner. The riders started wearing earpieces and moving in formations. They didn't just show up for intimidation, they coordinated. Small towns along the I-47 corridor started going quiet. Local sheriffs retired suddenly or vanished behind doors they didn't open anymore. Surveillance footage showed armored vans unloading men in tactical gear who moved like they'd trained at Fort Bragg. Something deeper had rooted itself in the riders. And when they tried to corner James at the market, they made a mistake. They expected him to flinch. Two of them boxed him near the back of the produce tent. One flashed a knife. Not for use, just display. The kind of move you make when you want everyone nearby to know who controls the tone of the day. James looked at the knife. Then at the man's feet. Then at his hands. And then, just for a second, he locked eyes. There was a shift, not in posture. Not in stance. In weight. In pressure. The man backed away. He didn't know why. He just knew the air around James had changed. James returned to his truck, made no scene, and drove home. But that moment, brief and unnoticed by most, had been recorded by a camera mounted inside a potted plant across the walkway. Facial recognition tagged both riders within 20 seconds. One had a record of arms dealing. The other was linked to a shell company tied to defense contractors in Virginia. The knife wasn't just for show. It had been laced with a polymer designed to delay coagulation, military issue. Experimental. James sat down in his command chair and opened a file he hadn't touched in 7 years. Storm Rider Upgrade Activity, Phase 2. Because this wasn't new. It was expected. The riders were just a front. They had always been a front. A shifting mask over something else. The real engine behind them was General Malcolm Roberts, a name scrubbed from headlines, but whispered in private rooms across the Pentagon. Retired from special operations under a shroud of secrecy, Roberts hadn't vanished. He'd evolved. With a Rolodex of elite former operatives and a pipeline to off-the-books weapons systems, he had spent the last decade building something never intended to be seen, a privatized military force designed for deniable operations on U.S. soil. Gangs were a testing ground. Control a few small towns. Seed them with professional muscle dressed in leather and chaos. Watch how local law enforcement reacted. Study the psychological thresholds of rural communities. Then scale. That was Roberts's playbook. But James had been watching. For 8 years. He had mapped every rider convoy, decrypted back-end comms buried under fake Bitcoin exchanges, triangulated secure drop zones, traced funds from dummy NGOs straight to overseas manufacturing fronts in Eastern Europe. He knew when new recruits were rotated in, what language cues were used during operational phases, which lieutenants were unaware they weren't running a gang anymore, They were part of a war game. James had let it all happen. Watched it grow. Allowed the illusion to take root. Because every system reveals itself fully when it believes it's invisible. What Roberts didn't know was that Eagle's Rest was a trap. Not for the writers. For him, James hadn't picked the town by accident. He had chosen it for geography, isolation, and sociocultural blind spots. People like Roberts underestimated rural communities. They assumed people in worn jeans and pickup trucks wouldn't notice small changes in patrol patterns, wouldn't care that cell towers were being upgraded with foreign-manufactured routers, wouldn't ask why the local military surplus shop suddenly had drones behind locked cabinets. James had counted on that arrogance, and now the time was coming. Roberts was planning a demonstration. Intelligence chatter had increased in the last 6 weeks. Encrypted exchanges between logistics companies, unusual fuel shipments, movement of palletized electronic warfare equipment. The writers had begun coordinating with 2 other gangs in nearby counties. One of James's embedded agents, a former Marine posing as a mechanic, had intercepted a coded directive outlining a full civilian pacification scenario. The plan was simple: stage a breakdown of local order, trigger a law enforcement withdrawal through targeted intimidation and sabotage, introduce emergency support via a private security firm linked to Roberts, then show foreign clients a test of how a privatized military could suppress a community in real time, with drones, predictive surveillance, and layered psychological control. IT was a dark evolution of counterinsurgency tactics once used overseas, and it was about to be deployed in Eagle's Rest. What Roberts didn't know was that James had already staged his counter-op. His cameras weren't just watching. They were streaming, encrypted copies routed to news outlets, intelligence watchdogs, and select Senate staffers via air-gapped relays. His servers were set to trigger evidence dumps the moment they detected a signal blackout or structural breach. He had created a kill switch that would upload every conversation, every transaction, every identity tied to the operation to a public-facing blockchain ledger, unerasable and globally accessible. James wasn't preparing to fight. He was preparing to expose. He didn't need to defeat the writers. He needed them to act exactly as planned. To show the world what had been brewing. To walk into the open thinking no one would be watching. Because the most dangerous kind of operator isn't the one who charges and it's the one who waits. And James had been waiting a long time. The first storm didn't come from the sky. It came from a fleet of blacked-out trucks just after midnight on a Friday, crawling into Eagle's Rest without headlights. 6 in total. 3 came from the northern pass, 2 from the river road, and 1, heavily armored, rolled up through Old County 12 where the power lines were weakest. James had known they were coming. 2 weeks earlier, his seismic sensors picked up tire patterns not consistent with local vehicles. Too heavy, too evenly spaced. 2 days before the trucks arrived, his hacked radio towers picked up encrypted pulses every 17 seconds, signaling calibration of directional antennas, likely jamming equipment. The day before, a drone flew over the lake 3 miles east. Not military issue, but fast. Silent. Thermal mast. They were staging. He didn't warn the town. Not yet. He needed the performance. He needed them to act like conquerors. He needed them to believe this was still their operation. The trucks rolled in just before 12:45 a.m. precisely. The riders came first, spreading out across downtown on bikes, their engines surgically quiet, their formations disturbingly tight. These weren't gang members anymore. These were rehearsed, disciplined operators, wearing body armor with internal comms and standoff weaponry. They took up positions near municipal buildings, power stations, and key intersections. In any other town, this would have been chaos, but Eagle's Rest didn't panic. James had seen to that. Over the past 6 years, he quietly worked with local farmers and townsfolk under the pretense of building an agricultural co-op. He'd introduced safety protocols, mostly framed around weather preparedness, drills for power outages, comms blackouts, and infrastructure failure. But buried inside those sessions were something else. Response layers. People knew how to go dark. Knew where to go. Which doors to lock. Which lights not to turn on. No panic. Just absence. Within 15 minutes of the riders deploying, the entire town dimmed to a whisper. It wasn't fear. It was procedure. From his underground command room, James watched as the operators made their first misstep. They spread too thin. Expecting resistance, expecting confusion, they were trying to be everywhere. That meant they weren't fully anywhere. At 1:12 a.m., the comms van activated. It was disguised as a delivery vehicle from a known logistics company, but James had flagged it a week ago through vehicle telemetry intercepts. He watched as the van initiated jamming protocols, disrupting phone towers, internet signals, and FM bands within a 3-mile radius, but James's systems were hardwired. His own encrypted network, built from retired military-grade hardware scavenged and adapted over years, operated through a directional signal burst on a frequency not used since the Gulf War. He was still watching, still recording, still relaying. He let them believe they'd silenced the town. At 2:03 a.m., General Malcolm Roberts arrived. The man stepped out of an SUV wearing civilian tactical gear, flanked by 2 ex-Special Forces bodyguards. He walked like he had full jurisdiction over the ground beneath his feet. This was his stage, his proof of concept. The demonstration began almost immediately. A live video feed, carefully edited and broadcast through a proprietary satellite link, showed Roberts briefing a small group of foreign observers in a private building 5 miles away. James had cracked the feed. Through a monitor inside his own bunker, he watched Roberts detail the mission profile. Rapid urban pacification. 0 civilian casualties. Behavioral control through disinformation, electronic suppression, and visible force presence. Entire population neutralized within 180 minutes. Tactical superiority, sustainable for long-term contract fulfillment. You are witnessing the future of localized military intervention, domestic and foreign, without the politics. Roberts called it Operation Quiet Anchor. James called it treason. He keyed in the first trigger. It was subtle. Just a power surge at the South Relay Station. Enough to force Roberts's comms van into a secondary diagnostic routine, briefly disabling its jamming shield. In that moment, James rerouted the entire feed through a ghost network, sending the live footage and audio to 5 major news outlets, 1 U.S. senator, and a covert Department of Justice task force James had once assisted during a cartel takedown in El Paso. The broadcast would go dark again in under 3 minutes. But it was enough. Enough to timestamp. Enough to implicate. He didn't need a gunfight. He needed receipts. The next phase of Roberts's operation was psychological. Pre-recorded audio of gunfire played through hidden loudspeakers. Flashbangs were detonated in controlled intervals. Drones buzzed above rooftops, displaying lights in specific patterns designed to simulate sniper activity. It was textbook fear management. Convince people that resistance is suicide. Then walk in like a savior. But Eagle's Rest didn't scatter. They'd been trained. When the riders approached the school to stage a hostage scenario, they found the building empty, doors sealed with internal locks installed under the pretense of safety renovations. When they reached the town hall, all power had been rerouted, lights on the outside, black on the inside. Every camera system there fed back fake loops from last year's July 4th parade. No one was home. No one was visible. It was a ghost town with a memory. And Roberts was confused. He ordered ground scans. Ordered data intercepts. But nothing made sense. His men began to report strange interference, movement patterns that didn't follow civilian behavior. People walking in lines across open fields at night, silently. Lights flickering in code. Animals released from pens in such a way as to trigger false alarms. It wasn't defense. It was disruption. The town itself had become an operating system, and it wasn't his. At 3:48 a.m., Roberts changed the plan. He moved from psychological operations to strategic demonstration, deploying 2 heavily armed squads to the town's eastern quadrant to stage a containment simulation. They were to secure 6 blocks, hold them, and simulate suppressive force. But James had laid that field weeks ago. Buried under garden plots and flower beds were sensor-activated sonic disruptors, small devices that, when triggered, emitted low-frequency pulses capable of inducing nausea, disorientation, and loss of balance. Harmless, non-lethal, but devastating. Within 5 minutes, Roberts's units began reporting equipment malfunctions, blurred vision, and internal confusion. One man dropped his rifle and vomited into his own helmet. It was at that point that Roberts said the words James had been waiting for. "Pull them back. Reset. Someone's here." Not someone. Everyone. James didn't smile. Not yet. He just waited. Watched. Logged every action, every transmission, every order. At 4:15 a.m., Roberts received word. His broadcast uplink had been compromised. His comms team couldn't trace it. But James had routed the loop into his own operation and now possessed every second of footage, every military-grade protocol illegally deployed on U.S. soil. He triggered the final failsafe. From 30 different backup stations, some hidden in grain silos, others in disguised farm trailers, James's AI-assisted upload program went live. Dozens of terabytes of evidence, encoded and timestamped, uploaded to international cloud storage servers, mirrored 3 times over, protected by zero-trust encryption that couldn't be deleted, only copied. The show was over. Roberts didn't know it yet, but he would. James Cooper hadn't slept in 31 hours. He sat in his chair, surrounded by softly humming monitors, and the low ambient rhythm of a command center that had served as his entire world for the better part of 8 years. On one screen, a live feed from the northern ridge showed the last of the black trucks disappearing over the hill. On another, satellite confirmation pinged every minute, signaling that the final round of digital evidence was being mirrored across 2 more nodes in Canada and Finland. The system was complete. The trap was sprung. And now all that remained was the quiet. He allowed himself 5 minutes to close his eyes, take a breath, and feel the weight he'd carried for almost a decade begin to slip from his shoulders. Not all at once. Not entirely. But enough to know it was no longer his burden alone. Then he stood. The world above had shifted. Literally. The terrain of Eagle's Rest had just been used as the stage for a demonstration of illegal paramilitary dominance, and its decisive failure. But for the people who lived there, the land still felt the same. The sky was soft and pale blue. The wind curled gently through the evergreens. The town's buildings, paint-chipped, brick-faded, looked no different than they had the day before. And yet everything had changed. James emerged from the hidden lift beneath his greenhouse just after 6 a.m., blinking in the early sunlight like a man waking up from a long winter. The streets were still empty, though not because of fear, because of understanding. People knew something had happened. Something big. But they also knew, instinctively, that there were layers to it they couldn't yet understand. They trusted James would explain. When the time was right, he walked slowly through town, passing storefronts and front yards he'd memorized years ago. He had built this walk into his daily routine for years. Same boots, same time, same deliberate pace. No one ever questioned it. He was the big, slow-moving guy with a plastic cup of coffee and too many thoughts to waste on conversation. Today, there was no coffee. No stall at the market. No vegetables. Just James. By the time he reached the square, half the town had quietly followed. Not in a crowd. In a presence. Doors opened. Porches emptied. Eyes watched. People leaned against rails and steps and mailboxes, not saying anything, just waiting. as if they all felt the air change but didn't know what it meant until he spoke, and he did. Not from a platform or a podium. Just from the base of the war memorial where he stopped and turned. He didn't raise his voice. "You've been safe for a long time," he said. "That wasn't an accident." Silence held, dense and respectful. "I came here because I needed to see what this country was becoming. And because I knew one day we'd need a place like this, out of sight, out of reach, out of the blast radius. A place to prove the truth still matters." He shifted, almost nervously. "I let bad things happen around us. I watched a machine build itself out of corruption, greed, and violence. I didn't stop it right away, because I needed people like Roberts to believe they could get away with it. I needed the whole thing exposed, not just wounded." He looked up, eyes sharper now. "And it's done. You're safe again. But not because of me. Because of us. Because no one here panicked. No one ran. You held the line, even if you didn't know that's what you were doing." He stepped back. That was all. And it was enough. Over the next days, the aftermath unfolded like a slow tide. Federal teams arrived, not suits with smiles, but serious agents with quiet voices and hard eyes. They moved with purpose and deference. The footage James had released had shocked half the nation. Within hours, emergency sessions had been called in Washington. The Secretary of Defense was grilled. The names of 2 senators appeared in leaked documents. A full criminal inquiry was launched against the firms Roberts had used as fronts. Laws were quietly rewritten. Security contracts frozen. Internal reviews began rippling through every major intelligence agency. In Eagle's Rest, nobody held signs. Nobody marched. They didn't need to. They had already won. Roberts was arrested that evening. Not in a blaze of glory, but sitting alone near the loading dock of the bottling plant, jaw slack, staring at nothing. His people had abandoned him. His chain of command had evaporated. His legacy had collapsed like sand underwater. James didn't watch the arrest in person. He was in the greenhouse, hands deep in soil, replanting basil, because life had to continue. And if it didn't, then what had any of it been for? The writers, stripped of leadership and funding, scattered. Most of them didn't even realize how close they'd come to being cannon fodder in a much larger war. They were pawns, leveraged and positioned, their image twisted into something sleek and efficient to impress foreign warlords and corporate buyers. When the truth came out, most of them just vanished. Some were arrested. Others flipped, testifying in exchange for protection. 1 or 2 came back to town months later, quiet, humbled. James let them stay. He didn't forget. But he believed in balance. In people finding roads back from the edge. 6 months later, Eagle's Rest had grown, not in size, in clarity. The people knew now that the world was more fragile than it looked, and that safety wasn't something handed down. It was built, layer by layer. Day by day, the town council approved funding for a permanent emergency preparedness center. James didn't run it. He trained others, taught classes, helped design response protocols. Kids from the local high school started showing up to volunteer. Not because they were afraid. Because they wanted to know what their parents had survived. Local papers ran stories. Podcasts wanted interviews. A documentary crew tried to set up shop. James said no. Not out of pride. But because some truths aren't content. Some victories don't need headlines. He did, however, publish one article. Just one. An op-ed in a quiet National Journal of Military Ethics, anonymously submitted, titled, "The Line Between Shadow and Shield." It described, in broad terms, the danger of turning warfare into a private ledger. How the slow creep of unregulated power feeds itself in silence. And how the most dangerous wars aren't the ones we see, but the ones we don't notice until they're already inside the wire. The piece went viral. It was quoted in Senate hearings, cited in law school lectures. The author remained unknown. Most didn't know it was written by a man who once pretended to be a tomato farmer just to save a country from its own blind momentum. Back in Eagle's Rest, James kept farming. People still called him Big Jim. The Saturday market came back. So did the laughter, the old-timers arguing about tractor engines, the kids sneaking chocolate from stalls. He didn't hide anymore. But he didn't stand in the light either. He just existed, gently, among the people he'd chosen to protect. Every now and then, someone from the outside world would drive through. Some reporter chasing ghosts. Some analyst looking for the man who exposed one of the most sophisticated illegal military operations in modern history. They'd ask around, but no one ever pointed. Because in Eagle's Rest, silence was more than a tradition. It was part of the soil, and James Cooper had become part of it. The town had changed, yes, but more importantly, it had learned, and that was what mattered, because the truth, once planted deep enough, grows roots no operation can tear out, not even one built over 8 years, not even one backed by power and shadow. James Cooper had held the line, and now the line would hold without him.